So hi everybody. Oh hey! I'm so sorry. It did not used to be this hard to drive and park in DC. It's just I haven't gotten used to the new thing yet. So welcome and thank you for coming and thank you for waiting. I apologize. Nothing drives me crazier than being late. I don't know what kind of introduction Tim gave you, but I'm Deborah Grayson and this is my work. And I guess how I got started on this is it really started during the pandemic. It still surprises me just what the aftermath of living in it has been. It was funny, I was watching some stupid TV show, I don't know what it was, and there was a scene where they had to get vaccines out into the community. And I don't know, for some reason I just burst into tears because I was like, how did we survive that? How did we get through that? But you know, I had flown back from Spain and got back to DC just in time before they just shut the world down. So I was at least glad that I made it back. And I was in my house trying to figure out what I was gonna do. And I wasn't gonna paint in oil paint because I don't like to paint in oil paint in my house. So I had scraps of wood and ink and I just started drawing on the blocks, and that's how I got back into woodcut and relief work and printmaking in general. And I haven't looked back, I haven't picked up a paintbrush in about 4 years. And so the work that's here is really about stories. I've always been interested in origin stories, where people are from, how they got here, what do they think about when they were making that transition, what's their connection to land and community and family. So it was all of those things that I was thinking about when I started making this work. The other thing, in my other life, I do a lot of research in science and technology. And I was in the process of studying mental health hospitals at the turn of the last century. Not a good time to be doing that work, but it was also a lot of irony because the things I was reading about that were happening in the 1900s were some of the same things that we were talking about during the pandemic in terms of equity and access and who got to stay home to work and who had to be exposed to the virus even before, you know, we had vaccines. And I still have the image in my head of all the body bags that people, you know, where they started stacking up because there was no place to put people. So as a way to kind of grind myself and just kind of get my bearings in the midst of all of that, I started reading stories about people, about immigration, about community development, and I ended up working with a stack of vernacular photographs. I've always collected photos. I can't go to an antique store or a flea market or whatever. If I see photo albums, I'm like, how did they get here? And who are these people? And so some of the portraits here are based on the images of people from those photographs where I just kind of made up stories about their lives. And some of them are from a medical facility. And it's a long story about how I got these images, where primarily women, primarily Black women, were housed in these hospitals. And they were often there for the most bizarre reasons, like desire for civil rights, or you know, not wanting to be oppressed in their daily lives, but also like real, I guess I'll use the word diagnosable illnesses. One woman, I was reading this story about her and reading the doctor's notes, and she had lost 7 children through miscarriage, and she was trying to cope. And so she was put in this institution, and so yeah, I think I would lose it, you know. But just the narrative that was written about her was really, I guess the word I'll use right now is interesting. And so I started drawing her, and again, imagining worlds and stories that were related to what her life could have been or should have been had she not lived during the time that she lived. So in terms of the images, I'll start chronologically. The 3 in the center are kind of a tail end of work that I had been working on that was just completely black and white. When I started woodcut, when I started working during the pandemic, I just was not dealing with color. I could only deal with the stark realities. And so the challenge here, when not using a lot of color, when only using black and white, or in this instance sepia, is how to convey emotion and feeling just through line, just through a single color. And so these were kind of the tail end of the transition from just black and white to color. So I used sepia here. And these are just portraits, again, from the photographs that I had collected and kind of reworked. So that's what those three are. After those came this one here. I think that one is called High Cotton. And someone was asking me during the opening, why are you using cotton? It conjures up all of this trauma and history. And I was like, yeah, that's part of why I did that. But the other part is cotton is a part of my own origin story. My maternal family comes from North Carolina, and like a lot of folks, black folks who migrated on the East Coast, we ended up in DC either because we run out of money or because we just decided, you know, this was the place to be. And so what I'm trying to do in all of these images is balance the story a little bit, because the story is not just about trauma. Even though that's a part of it, we still lived our lives, we still loved, we still, you know, went on with business. And so all of these images, I'm just trying to capture a stillness, but also a narrative that counters this notion of trauma. So that was the first one. It was also a jump for me because I rarely use reds and pinks in my work. And so it was funny to me that this came out pink, and then it just, as you will see, got deeper and deeper. So this is the second one, still amidst the cotton, a deeper kind of orange. And this is when I started messing around with fluorescent pigments. And so I used a little here. I really went crazy there in playing with the color. But at this point, for me, this kind of cool red and warm red that I've been playing with, some flat, some shiny, some with fluorescent pigment, some not, really became a part of the story. And I love the color because it vibrated, and it also made the cotton kind of pop off the surface. And sometimes you'll see these lines in my work. I actually do that on purpose because I like a little bit of line or noise in my work. And what happens is just, you know, I do all of this by hand, and depending on the gouge I'm using, sometimes I really clear away the surface, and sometimes they're just remnants. And I kind of like that because it kind of speaks to, again, the layers that I like to play with in the work. I mean, I use this process of relief printing because there's so many puns that you can do with this. I mean, it's a relief to be able to work on this. It's a relief in terms of techniques. There are layers of color and texture. There are layers to the story. So the process connects to the story in my mind. So this was the second one. The third one in the series is my own origin story. And this is called Ahoskie is on the other side of Harlem, because my maternal family comes from Ahoskie, North Carolina.
So does mine.
Oh, cool. Small town, too. We should talk. Might be related. And so my grandfather and his brothers left North Carolina. Some of them stayed in DC. The rest of them continued up into New York. When my grandparents met, they actually met in Harlem, and my mother grew up in Harlem until her teens when she moved here, and she and my father were at the integrating class of Coolidge High School in Northwest. And so this is me, but me as in character, not me as me. So I don't consider this a self-portrait, but sometimes I use myself as a model because, as I say, I'm always available. So I use myself as a model for this one. And this, again, it kind of picks up on the story of my family. The next one in the series is this one. And this is called, this is the title piece, They See Love as a Reddening of the Earth Under the Sun. And it's actually a line from a book I read that I just thought was hilarious called Poppy Show by Leon Ross. And this was inspired by two friends who got married this year. And so the idea is that my hope for them is that their past, their present, and their future, that they'll just have eternal love. So that's what that's about. And I put in a little sacred geometry, which kind of reflects that. And then the last one in terms of the reds and pinks is, again, me using myself as a model. And it's called Past Life Premonitions. And I call it that because when I think of time, especially post-pandemic, It's like, I don't know about you all, but sometimes I have to stop and think, what time is it? What day is it? What month is it? You know, it's like time is happening all together on the same plane. The past, the present, and the future. Historically, politically, for a number of us, it really feels like we're living in the past, but I promise you, we are supposedly in the middle of the 21st century. And so the title, Past Life Premonition, is talking about those planes of time all being on the same level. But also it's this feeling that I often find myself feeling where I have these memories of things that I know I didn't live through. And so it's like sometimes, rather than some people can predict or project into the future, sometimes I'm projecting and thinking in the past, like what happened and how did we get here? And so that's what that one is about. People have asked me about the heart and what is she doing with it. I can't tell you, I don't know. The image comes to me and I work it. Is she offering her heart? Is she taking it back? Is it a protective pose? I tend to think she's open, and it scares me a little bit because that makes her super vulnerable if that's what she's doing. So if someone's gonna ask me that question here today, I'm gonna tell you I don't know. I'm gonna leave it to you to think about that one. And then the last two are these two on the ends here. I forgot the title of this. It is, oh yes, Softly as the Morning Comes, 1 and 2. In addition to literature, music is really heavy influence. I can tell you what I was listening to when I worked on each of these pieces. And for these two end pieces, it was Cleo Sol, who's a British singer. These two pieces actually were studies. I try to maintain a sustainable practice, so I had scrap wood that I was working on, and you can even see it around the edges. That's okay with me. And I drew these because I'm thinking about a bigger piece, and so I was playing around with the composition. And so later on next month, I will have finished a triptych that has these two. It's the same woman, these two poses plus another one, and the piece is about this big, it's huge. And so I ended up liking the studies, and so that's how I landed on those two pieces. So that would be my opening kind of commentary about what I was thinking and doing as I was building this collection. And I hope the rest of the time we have here, it can be more like a conversation, because I don't want to stand here and talk at you. And would love to answer any questions that you have about process or technique or anything like that, color, ink, whatever. I'm happy to answer that.
I was curious, did your reference images have closed eyes, or did you just close everybody's eyes?
I closed everybody's eyes. That's a question no one's asked me, thank you. Yeah, I closed everyone's eyes. Most of my figurative work right now, with the exception of that one, she has her eyes slightly ajar, or slightly open, ajar, it's an internal connection. It's kind of activating your third eye. It's kind of a reflection of stillness. And so, yeah, I closed everyone's eyes. I didn't even realize I was doing it. Even when I'm thinking through something hard or I'm transitioning, I talk about shifting brains from doing one kind of analytical task to another. I find myself closing my own eyes to kind of reset. So that's why I do that, yeah.
And yeah, like how you kind of oscillate between the making and the research phases of your work?
That's a great question. So actually by profession, I'm trained as a researcher. I spent a lot of time in dusty buildings, digging around, looking at stuff that nobody else is looking at or looking for. But I have to blame my father for how it started. When I was a little girl growing up here, we would tape, because then it was still VCR, we would tape the football game, and then he would drive me down here, and we would either go to the Library of Congress or the National Archive, and we just loved looking at old newspapers and old images. And we had this thing through the centuries where we would look up what was happening on our birth dates. So for the first maybe 10, 15 years of my career, I was a professor. So I'm used to like reading lots of stuff, synthesizing it, and being able to convey it to people. And at that time, I was often writing stuff, but for me, my first language is always visual. So even now when I have to talk about something, I visualize what it looks like, I visualize the workflow, I visualize the process. Sometimes it has color, sometimes it has taste or sound. Kind of odd, but that's just how I'm wired. And so even something like this, it's weird for me to talk about the work because I feel like I said what I needed to say in the work. And so, at least until I was cursing trying to find a parking space, I was actually thinking about how I would connect the verbal, the language to the visual language. But it's usually, I always have a stack of books or a stack of articles or a stack of images that I've sourced through research libraries, through archives, through random snippets that jump out at me when I'm reading a novel, like that one came from a novel. And then I have a big notebook, one that has words and one that just has images. And then I play between those. I work between those. Or sometimes I'll draw on loose sheets and just look at them across the table. And I like to make connections between seemingly disconnected things. And so that's usually how it starts. But it's always the visual, and then the language comes after, the spoken word comes after.
Any more on cotton?
You know, this is a series. Yes, possibly. Possibly. So in addition to cotton, there are a couple of different repeating images in my work, or motifs, if you will. So cotton is one, nails is another. And so these are nails. It's, sometimes they're super clear, sometimes they're not. Some type of reflection. This material is usually reflective, closed eyes. I'm trying to think of what are the things that repeat. Oh, big hair, because I think of hair as kind of antennae. So I'm not sure. The next two have nails in them. Yeah, and one of them has cotton in it. So I at least have one or two more that have that motif, that imagery.
So when I first came to know your work, you were working in 3D. Mm-hmm. And you explained how during the pandemic you turned back to woodcut. I'm curious how these woodcuts relate to earlier woodcuts that you did. And, you know, were you surprised along the way how things evolved? And also it would be really interesting if you would break down one of these reductive prints and tell us a little bit more about that process.
Sure. I have to think more about your first question, and you may have to remind me of it, but I will tell you the process of how I do this. So one, because I do try to maintain a sustainable practice, which means really using everything that I have, all in terms of materials, trying to use non-toxic materials, although I admit I love oil, ink. I've tried to use the water soluble. I just don't like it, so I do that. But I use, low odor, low chemical cleaners. I don't use dryers in terms of my materials. But so I use one block, and so reduction color print means I use one block to create the image. Typically, you'll find people who use one block for each color, but to me, that's a lot of waste. The good part about that, though, is if you mess up, you can make another block and all is not lost. But if you use one block and you screw it up, you either redo the composition, which I have done multiple times, or you scrap it and start all over again. So that's the scary part. I think it was Picasso who called this type of reduction print suicide printing because of that fact. I know, because if you mess up, it's over. But I think he was one of the people who popularized this approach. So the first thing I do, I draw my image and then I redraw it in reverse because I want it to show up on a particular way. Most printmaking processes, they show up in reverse. So I draw with a pencil and then I go back in with more detail to use a Sharpie, and then I color code each layer so that as I'm working I don't have to stop and think about, okay, this entire layer is orange, this entire layer is brown, this entire layer is sepia or black. I use Sharpies to color code it. I lightly spray it with shellac because I'm going to run so many times through the press with the block, so that my drawing stays in place. And then I sand it down, and then I start to carve. So the first thing I carve, if there are whites on the in the image, is the cotton. So everything that was going to be white, I carved out. But the first color that I print, and this is simultaneous, that first layer, was the orange layer. So the first thing that you see is the orange layer and just the white. And so then once that's done, carve away all the pieces that I don't want the ink to be in contact with. And so that means carving away all the orange. And my next color, I think, was this lighter tan color. And so I print again, then I carve that away. So each layer, each color represents the next thing that you have to carve away. And you have to think in reverse. It's hard to explain, but you have to think in reverse and think of where is the roller or the brayer going to be in contact with next, because it's the relief, the raised pieces are what accept the ink. And so sometimes it's not intuitive until you get into a rhythm of it. So then once I've done that, I've carved away the light brown, and then I think the next color, no, I think it was the pink, then the brown, then the sepia. So this was a 4-color because I was just kind of figuring this out. And so again, I have to think in advance a few steps because I knew I wanted this pink. I had to identify that, then carve it away so that it wouldn't be painted over or inked over for the next color when I did this light brown. The very final layer, the darkest color, which is often black for most people, but I tend not to like black in my work. So this is a deep sepia. It's called the key block, the key block, it's called that because it captures all of the detail. So it really doesn't look like a final image until you bring those final details. Before that key block, you just have shapes of color, which can be fun too. And so when I really like just the blocks, I usually will print an extra one to play with later. It could be a completely different composition, but at least for this, the key block brings all the detail. The most important part of all this is the registration, because someone was asking me during the opening, how do you do that so that it lines up? Well, what I have is a 6 by whatever width block. So this was, what was this, final paper, 22 by 30. So I had a 6-inch by 22 long block of wood. And so what I do is I take the block that I'm printing and I push those two things together. The smaller block has pins attached to it, and pins are these flat metal pins, I don't know another word, and it has a little raised bump on it, and then there are plastic tabs that you put over there to hold your paper in place. And so each time I do this, I butt the two blocks, I have my paper rolled up, connect my pins on, and then roll the paper across the block, then put on some scrap paper, and then I use a board, some masonite board. For woodcut, I never use blankets, and run it through the press. And so that's how I print it. So I joked, I said, especially since I'm working bigger, by the end of the summer, my biceps are going to be incredible because it is no joke. And I do most of this by myself, where you're lifting the block, moving it, you know, and I have it set up kind of like in a kitchen triangle style. I have the ink plate, I have my paper, and then my press, and so I'm constantly walking in this triangle. I wear an Apple Watch. One afternoon, I looked at my watch, I had walked 3,000 steps. And that was just one layer. That was one layer of color. 3,000, yeah. So it also keeps you fit. It's a byproduct of woodcut. It keeps you really fit. 3,000 steps for one color. So 4 colors, you do the math. So does that help? Does that make sense? And now remind me of what your first question was.
I was just curious how these woodcuts look in relation to, you know, and how long ago it was when you were last doing woodcuts.
So the last time I did woodcut before the pandemic, I was in graduate school. I won't tell you how many decades, but that was a while ago. And they were small, they were 8 by 10. And when I couldn't write anymore, I was working on my dissertation, I remember this, I would go make art. So I would there was this really nice community center that I would go to down the street from the library. And I would go quilt with these older women and laugh my behind off. I'll keep it clean. I would laugh. Or I would carve blocks. And so they were 8 by 10 and they were one color because I didn't know how to register correctly. So yeah, so the color, so it evolved. My skills grew. And I would do art every now and then until I realized, oh, I'm happiest when I'm making art. So yeah, even my family knew that. They're like, when was the last time you drew something? If I was cranky, they would ask me that. So yeah. Other questions?
You mentioned quilting. Is that still part of your practice?
No, it isn't. Again, it's really interesting the kinds of things that have happened to me over the last 4 years. But I stripped away a lot of distraction and I got really focused. And so textiles, Jackie mentioned that I used to work in 3D. I used to work with clay and textiles and created these, some small figures, some very large figures. And I gave all of my materials away, all of my clay, all of my extruders, all of that away because I really know that this is where I want to go with my work. So I will probably make a quilt for my niece when she goes off to college, and I'm going to start now. She is 12, so I should have it done by the time she goes to college. But beyond that, I don't really do it anymore. Yeah. I still have the sewing machines. I won't give those away, but I really focused my practice. So it's the various processes within printmaking will keep you busy for a lifetime because I do woodcut, lithography, and right now I'm playing with combination of lithography and monoprint and some screen print. So, yep.
So to that, I'm wondering, you know, you're branching out different types of printmaking, but would you ever go 3D with your work, or do you want to stay 2D and work some paper?
You know, it's been in my brain. I have a friend, I'm a member of Black Women of Print, and Althea Murphy Price does a lot of 3D printing in her work. And she's got me intrigued. I'm like, don't go over there, Deborah, stay away from the bright light. Also, we have all this cool stuff at work, and so I'm like, so I may. It's not hitting me right now in terms of the next things I want to do, but I never say never. So, yeah. And who knows what the technology will be next week, so, yeah.
Because I'd be curious to see like texture, maybe more texture coming out in the work tied to your former quilt practice.
Yeah. So that's interesting you say that. So one of the things I am doing with this is building up texture and layers using different media that do things to the surface of the paper and printing over that. And it's either like building up layers of Japanese lace paper, something I've been experimenting with, or using acrylic mediums and creating a surface and then printing on top of that. So that's something I'm playing with. So that's a little bit of 3D, but I'm not finished here yet. There's still more that I want to play with. So.
All right. Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. Other questions?
Your work is terrific.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm building a playlist on Spotify, so you'll be able to hear some of the stuff that I listen to. It's quite the range. One of my colleagues that's down the hall, he's like, I never know what you're gonna play. So yeah, it just depends on the mood. It can be anything, from metal to country to R&B. Yeah, it just depends. Nothing else? I think I've said all I can think of to say about it. Thank you.